Hi everyone, good morning and welcome to Community Law and Mediation's webinar on the Climate Action Plan consultation, the Climate Conversations. We're really delighted to have you here this morning and we're thrilled to be joined by our guest speakers, Sadhbh O'Neill and Sean McCabe. And before I hand over to Sean and Sadhbh, I just want to give a brief overview of what the Climate Conversations is and how you can participate in this consultation. So the Climate Conversations is a key forum through which people can have their say on climate action, how it affects them, and the policies that they'd like to see implemented. It's designed to inform the Climate Action Plan 2024. So you don't need to be an expert on climate change. You don't need to answer every single question in this survey. But if you would like some guidance in completing the survey, CLM Centre for Environmental Justice has prepared an environmental justice guide to the consultation. And I'm just going to share my screen with you briefly to give you a brief overview of what that looks like. So if you go to CLM's website, and I'll link this in the chat box in a moment, under the news section of our website, we have provided a response template, so explaining what the consultation is, a link to the survey where you can participate, and then important to remember that the deadline for the consultation is this Friday, the 8th at 5:30 p.m. So the consultation has 5 main sections, and you can take a click down here, for example, and like the first section has 5 multi-choice questions about your views on climate change. And at the end of each section, there's a comment box where you can provide additional information and add further comments if you think they're necessary. So we have provided some draft comments that you can use and adapt as you see fit within each section of the consultation. And then in the last section on moving towards sustainable living, there are 2 comment boxes. So we've separated those into 2 different sections here. The last section then, the 5th section, is personal. That's just asking about some of your personal details, like your income bracket, your living situation, and you can choose to answer or not answer those questions. So I'll provide a link to that in the comment box in a minute. And then just to say as well, what is the Climate Action Plan? So the Climate Action Plan and its annex of actions are published annually. And the purpose of the Climate Action Plan is to actually set out a roadmap for meeting Ireland's legally binding carbon budget. So our carbon budget is the total amount of emissions that can be emitted by Ireland during a 5-year period. And at the moment, our current carbon budget runs from 2021 to 2025. So we are 2.5 years into our current carbon budget programme, and unfortunately Ireland remains 3rd worst emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the EU per person. And the latest projections by the Environmental Protection Agency and by An Taisce show that Ireland will fall significantly short of its 2030 legally binding emission reduction targets. So from Community Law and Mediation's perspective, it's really essential that the Climate Action Plan 2024 quantifies the reductions in emissions that are actually expected from the implementation of the plan and its annex. The annex must be published alongside the Climate Action Plan itself, because for the last 2 years, the annex has been published a couple of months after the plan itself is published. And then finally, the emissions gap needs to be closed. We know that we've been burning through our carbon budget and that we are now really overdue in trying to meet those emission reduction targets. But I'm now delighted to hand over to our expert speakers. I'm first going to hand over to Sean McCabe. Sean is the Head of Climate Justice and Sustainability with the Bohemian Football Club. So I'll let you take it away, Sean, and I might actually make you co-host so you can share your screen as well.
Lorna, it's a pleasure to be here, and fair play for hosting this event to enable people to participate more knowledgeably in the consultation. I'm going to talk briefly today. Let me just make sure I can share my screen. I'm going to talk about climate justice and the Climate Action Plan, and just more specifically climate justice, what that would look like in Ireland, both in terms of our obligations globally and our obligations domestically. Is this work? It is. You can see this all right, yes? I'm presuming with the presentations coming through. Okay, so if we ask what climate action would look like in the Irish context, I think that would mean doing what's required, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation, doing what's required to provide a safe planet for our children, for those living today in the most climate vulnerable parts of the world. Or at the very least, if we can't do that, the very least we should do is abide by the most ambitious goals set out by the Paris Agreement. Because we know that the impacts of climate change are getting worse, they're deepening, they're spreading globally, and it would be immoral not to be aspiring towards the most ambitious dimensions of the Paris Agreement. Domestically, it should be enabling people to realise their rights in the face of the climate crisis, or failing that, at least attempting to reach the furthest behind first, as is the ambition called for in the Sustainable Development Goals and its preamble. So internationally, are we holding up our end of the bargain? The Eco-Equity and the Stockholm Environment Institute worked together in advance of the Paris Agreement to create a tool which is continuously updated, called the Climate Equity Reference Calculator. It's really a really interesting tool. I'd encourage people to browse it. It can be a little bit complicated to begin with, but you get a hang of it pretty quickly. You can input parameters that let it know what you want to explore for what country, and what type of weighting you want to give, for example, to current capacity to act on climate change versus historical responsibility to act. You can give it estimates of where you want to get to, whether that's 1.5 degrees Celsius with no overshoot, the 1.5 degrees Celsius as is expressed in the Paris Agreement, or the 2 degrees Celsius as is expressed in the Paris Agreement. If you see here, looking at what is the 1.5 degrees Celsius target in the Paris Agreement, calculated excluding land use. This estimates that between what we're doing domestically and what we fund internationally, we should be able to say that we're at zero this year. And then we should proceed from this year to go into net negative emissions. So let me explain. The sand-coloured line above the green dash would be our own mitigation from business as usual. So reducing, and I'll explain this more in depth in the next few slides. So reducing the CO2 that we are emitting domestically. The grey black line at the top is where we're heading for on business as usual. The green dash line is where this tool would require us to go. And then the blue line indicates what would be both our own domestic emissions and what we would be funding internationally as part of our commitment to international climate finance. So just to recap on our own target under the Paris Agreement, I should say that that red dot actually is what is our target under the Paris Agreement. So what is our target under the Paris Agreement? Well, we're a part of the EU's target under the Paris Agreement, which was last submitted in December 2020. And that's to reduce emissions by at least 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. About 52 to 54% below 1990 levels, excluding land use and land cover. That you don't need to worry about that too much, but what it is important to worry about is the dates, the numbers, and this last point is that the Paris Agreement itself, when it was published, many people thought it was very insufficient. And it was to keep to the 1.5 degree goal, which keeps a lot of islands above water. The Paris Agreement was insufficient. So they built into it a ratchet mechanism to periodically increase ambition all the way to 2030. So this EU target of 55% was itself an increase on the initial nationally determined contribution, which Europe said it would do under Paris. And you can be sure that before 2030, there will be another ratchet called for under the UN Convention on Climate Change. So we should expect that 55% figure to increase. However, the devil is in the baselines, right? So under Ireland's Climate Act, Ireland's committed to a 51% reduction of emissions by 2030, which would stack up reasonably against the EU's 55% target. However, the target year for the EU emissions reductions is 1990. which is different to Ireland's, which is 2018. What does that mean? Well, if we normalize our emissions and the EU emissions at 100% at 1990 levels, right? And then calculate how our emissions changed from 1990 to the present day, you'll see that actually Ireland is still above our emission levels at 1990. We hit a peak around the mid-Celtic Tiger area where we had a number of years in the high 128, 129% above 1990. Sorry, not 28 or 29% above 1990. We're now about 13% above 1990. The EU 27 has the rest of our neighbors, and they're not just big emitters and they're not just rich countries, right? We're very much in the middle of the pack in economically. The rest of our neighbors have reduced their emissions by a collective 30%. So they're very much well on track to reach their 45% target, and they will do that. Sorry, so that's their reduction of 55%, which would leave them with 45% of 1990s emissions. We, on the other hand, have picked 2018 as our baseline. So we're going to do quite a dramatic drop of 51% from 2018, which will leave us still at about 56% of 1990 emissions. So there's a significant target, about 11% difference between what we are committed to through our Climate Act and what the EU has committed to under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then, as Clodagh was mentioning, the latest EPA report shows that we'll actually only make about 29% of our commitment versus 2018, which ultimately means we'll only be at about 81% of 1990 levels, and almost twice any other, twice the EU combined reduction. I think that's really important to know. This is decades of being a climate laggard is really catching up with us, and we're falling very, very far behind. So what does this mean for where we're going? Well, we're nowhere near living up to our fair share of ambition in terms of climate action. From a climate justice perspective, we're not doing enough to prevent the problem. What about supporting others in tackling their issues in terms of dealing with the problem? Well, it was good that Ireland produced its first ever climate finance roadmap in 2022. It was very positive to see that. What was maybe somewhat less encouraging was there's only one real substantial number in the roadmap, which was a commitment to an aggregate figure of climate finance. On the right-hand side here, you see an ODI assessment of climate finance that has been paid to 2020 and that will be paid by 2025. And you see that whilst Ireland is moving up from the orange, which is very insufficient, to insufficient, which is the yellow, we're still only at about 28% of our fair share. Now, it's really, really important to state here that the climate finance fair share that's calculated off is 100 billion per year. Well, it's actually 100 billion static, which was supposed to be delivered by 2020 as a collective amount of climate finance globally. Grossly insufficient. The level of climate finance promised by Gordon Brown in 2012 after the collapse of the Copenhagen Accords, which would have given us the Paris Agreement 5 years earlier, cannot still be the amount of money that we're aiming for today to mobilize for climate finance. It's insane that it is. And even though we have quite an insanely low bar for climate finance, which is the cause of serious heartache for developing countries trying to deal with this enormous crisis, and being told at the same time that they can't develop using fossil fuels, so they have to find different, more expensive pathways for development. The fact that we're not even able to make our fair share of an absurdly low number is very concerning. So I should pause and say for a minute, the quality actually of our climate finance is very good. We have a good history of overseas development support. We have a good history of working with frontline communities. And so I'd say with confidence that the way we use our climate finance is good. It's just that the quantity remains significantly insufficient. Our fundamental failure in terms of climate is our tax haven status. And this is a really important piece to touch on. Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, which you can see on the left-hand side, says this agreement in enhancing the implementation of the convention, including its objective, aims to strengthen the global response to the threat to climate change in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty, including by, and look at section C down there, making financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. We have led a race to the bottom in terms of the global corporate tax regime. Figures, the average corporate tax in Europe in 1990, around the time of these emissions that we're calculating, was about 40%. The average corporate tax rate now is a struggle to get it to 15%. And the effective tax rate, which is what companies are actually paying, is way, way less than that. And so what that means is that trillions, literally trillions of dollars are being taken out of countries' budgets, including our own budgets, by the way. Like, being a tax haven hurts the people who live in the tax haven too, as well as people around the world. And so we're looking at taking 4.7 trillion over the next decade out of countries' budgets. That's more than enough to tackle the climate crisis. We could do very significant things if that 4.7 trillion was going to climate action rather than the already obscenely rich in the world. Quick word domestically. I won't go on any much longer because I know, and I'm looking forward to Sadhbh's presentation as well. I'm sure Sadhbh has a lot to add to this. I just wanted to say just really quickly that we cannot become a country where only the rich can afford cheap bills. It's obvious that climate action is good for people. Like being able to retrofit your home is great. Getting solar panels is great. Having like reliable public transport that's effective and gets you places. It's really positive. It can change the world for the better. But we live in a country that's really struggling. Like having 13% at risk of poverty last year is a real issue. Having over 200,000 people living in consistent poverty is a real issue. And then over nearly 700,000 experiencing enforced deprivation. Like, how are these people going to take part in the climate transition? That's the serious question we have to ask ourselves. And the thing about climate action is it has to be grounded in a sense of enlightened self-interest, that unless everyone can do it, the work that does get done is pointless because we need everyone involved to get it over the line. But there's a second piece, and that's that people have to associate climate policy with improving their lives. If they think climate policy is about tightening their belts and making life more challenging for them when it is already, and these statistics bear it out, significantly challenging, the risk we run is that those people will turn against climate action because they will associate it not with warmer homes and cheaper bills and a higher standard of living, but they'll associate it with a harder life. And then they'll vote for people who promise them that they will do nothing on climate, that they will roll back climate action, that they'll do away with the climate. So we need to be very careful. We're standing at a crossroads and we need to respect the fact that people are so far behind. Our actions don't say that we're working to reach the furthest behind first. We have a very significant surplus budget, our budget surplus this year, that we could, if we wanted to, and if the political will was there, and we could put that into climate action, and we could do an awful lot very quickly. In responding to your climate action plan submissions, what I would recommend is that attention is drawn to issues of ambition and issues concerning the amount of money that our Department of Finance is putting into these actions. Unless we get very serious very quickly about how we're funding climate action in this country, who's going to benefit from it, how we're going to reconcile it with an existing cost of living crisis, how we're going to reconcile it with the current eviction rates that we're seeing and the housing crisis that we're seeing and the financialization of housing that we're seeing, how we're going to keep people positive about climate action through a period when their lives are in significant stress. They're the types of questions that we should be posing. And if you're experiencing energy poverty, or if you're experiencing eviction, or you're experiencing things that are putting you in a situation where climate action seems to be the last thing you can possibly think of, the submission for the climate action plan is a place to say that. It's not just about talking about abstract concepts of emissions and impacts. It's about talking about how you, on a day-to-day basis, might or might not be able to do what you would like to do in terms of climate action. That's all I have. I hope that makes sense. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Sean. That was so excellent. And what a compelling case for taking part in the consultation and talking about the barriers to climate action that are faced by people you know or you yourself. I've just sent a link to our environmental justice guide conversation into the chat box. That may or may not be useful, but feel free to use it as you see fit. I'm now going to hand over to Sadhbh O'Neill. Sadhbh is the coordinator of the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition and the Climate Campaigns coordinator of Friends of the Earth Ireland. So I'll make you co-host as well, Sadhbh, so that we can.
I think I should be able to share anyway. I'll just bring the slides up and you can let me know if you can see my slide.
Perfect.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much again for the invitation, Clodagh. It's a very timely opportunity to talk to people who are interested in making a submission. I have to say, I found the consultation website set up by the department extremely frustrating, and it seems to be an exercise in not just focusing on individual behavior change, but also kind of data harvesting, or perhaps the kind of line of questioning is designed to force you to think about things you hadn't even intended to say in the consultation. So as Clodagh says, I think it would be great to use the opportunity in the boxes for additional comments to give the government feedback about additional measures that you think should be included in the climate action plan, and just a different perspective from the kind of line of questioning, which, as I say, I found very frustrating myself. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the climate action plan itself, its role in the climate policy cycle. And I've just selected a few areas where I can give you some suggestions of inputs. It's actually a very comprehensive plan, or at least it's supposed to be. So it's not possible to get into the level of detail or to cover all the sectors. That's just the nature of climate action. It's becoming extremely broad and focused and technical. Having said that, a lot of the measures in the plan don't add up yet to what is required, even under the Irish law, never mind the broader climate justice obligation that Sean has referred to. But just to recap quickly on why the climate action plan is important, and why it's important for us to pay attention to what is being agreed and to have our voices heard. It's a really critical part of the climate law, and it basically sets out the government's plans to reach the 2030 and ultimately, as each plan evolves every year, the 2050 or the net zero target. So the law establishes an obligation on the government to achieve climate neutrality. And it's required then to introduce sectoral emission ceilings that carve out what is already an agreed carbon budget. So you've got these three different elements. You've got the carbon budgets, which are supposed to set a maximum ceiling on greenhouse gas emissions for 5-year periods. And the two carbon budgets for 2025 and up to 2030 are supposed to add up to that 51% reduction in the climate law. In addition to that, the carbon budgets are then carved out across different sectors, and they're called sectoral emission ceilings. I'll show you the graph here. And I'm not going to go into the numbers here, but it's just important to highlight a couple of things. Firstly, the categories of sectors that are there on the left mirror the IPCC methodologies for measuring and accounting for greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the kind of categories we're working with in climate action, tend to be sort of fairly fixed in that way. There are other chapters in the climate action plan that deal with cross-cutting measures and just transition. But in terms of accounting for greenhouse gas emissions, those are the real categories we're working with. And the other thing to point out is that you'll see there under LUCF, which is land use and land use change and forestry, it's one of the categories of emissions, but it's also a sink. So because of that challenge in measuring exactly how much carbon is being absorbed by the land and how much carbon is being released by the land, there's no target set for the two carbon budgets under the LULUCF sectors. And the other thing to point out, and this is still the case, is that the government hasn't figured out how to devise sectoral emission ceilings that are going to meet the 51% emission reduction target. So for that reason, they've created this category called unallocated savings, which is really, we don't know how to reach the target. So we've created this category where there's 26 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that they haven't figured out yet how to allocate to any individual sector. And that's an enormous reduction that hasn't been planned for. And there's no sort of idea yet whether that will go to transport or the built environment or whatever. So that's a problem. That's a big problem. The other thing, just again, indicatively, these are the approved carbon budgets. So we have 3 carbon budgets. The third of them is a provisional carbon budget, and the first 2 have been set under law, under the process set out in the climate law. And these are legally binding. So once these numbers have been turned into sectoral emission ceilings that I showed you on the previous slide, they're legally binding on those sectors. So the climate plan, the climate action plan then is a roadmap of the actual measures designed to ensure that each sector adheres to the overall carbon budget and its sectoral emission ceiling. However, the EPA advised in their latest report in 2023 that the planned policies and measures, even if they're fully implemented, are only going to result in a 29% emission reduction by 2030. So Sean has already referred to that. And in addition, the greenhouse gas inventory, which is the kind of measuring of all the emissions across those different sectors, is showing just a very, very small decrease. So instead of those 4.8% annual decreases in emissions, we're only seeing a decrease of 1.9. So as a result, they are saying that the first 2 carbon budgets will not be met, and by a significant margin. So this is very worrisome because, as Clodagh said at the beginning, we're only a couple of years into the carbon budget, and it's already clear that we're not going to meet it. Now, there are a couple of challenges that Ireland faces. We have very high rates of economic growth, which is unusual. We also have a population increase, which is quite dramatic, actually, given Ireland's history, and we are that is putting a certain kind of strain on greenhouse gas emissions. But this is not the place to be discussing that. We're just going to say this is the law and this is what they have to do. So they're going to have to devise the measures to account for both the rates of economic growth, rising energy demand, and population growth. So the Climate Change Advisory Council has, not just this year, but I think in previous years as well, called on the government to be much more specific in quantifying the kind of emission reductions and matching those with measures that would deliver the emission reductions required to close the emission gap. So the Climate Action Plan, if you read it, the 2023 Climate Action Plan is actually quite detailed and comprehensive. But if you read it closely, you'll notice that a lot of the measures are kind of internal process measures. It's like we need a plan for EV charging infrastructure. So there's a kind of detailed list of kind of tasks that go with that, setting up a working group, you know, and allocating the finance, figuring out how to make sure there's enough electricity on the grid in those places. Now, all of those things are obviously necessary, but they're not sufficient to meeting the target of emission reduction. So the challenge is that the Climate Action Plan contains a very important roadmap for the kind of activities that are required by government and agencies to deliver on the target, but they by themselves don't kind of specifically pin down the measures that are going to be required to make sure that people actually buy EVs or use their internal combustion engine cars, you know, less often, and so on and so forth. So a lot of it is somewhat vague, and this is partly because there's a reliance on market-based instruments in the main to create the kind of price signals and the incentive structures for people to make these adjustments. So the government is loath to regulate emissions directly. So what do we have to say about that? Well, these are the recommendations that Stop Climate Chaos made, and they kind of mirror the sort of campaigning goals that Climate Action Network Europe and international and groups have been calling for years. The first thing is, if you're talking about, you know, market-based mechanisms, we need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. It makes no sense to be trying to encourage certain kinds of technologies or behavior change when in fact the opposite is what's being promoted through the use of fossil fuel subsidies. And this is complex because in Ireland, fossil fuel subsidies also include some of the welfare subsidies, for example, the fuel allowance. So if we're going to switch that payment into a form of support for sustainable energy, it needs to be designed and tailored quite carefully. But having said that, CSO analysis indicates that Ireland spends over €2 billion per annum subsidising fossil fuels, and that includes some really deep subsidies in the agricultural sector as well. The challenge is that carbon taxes are never going to be high enough to accelerate or achieve decarbonisation. So if you did use just market-based measures, you could just make energy so expensive that nobody uses it, and you know you could do that in a very punitive way, but it would be very socially unfair. It would completely undermine any concept or support for a just transition or for environmental justice. So that's out. We can't rely on carbon taxation to deliver the agenda by itself, but as a part of a kind of portfolio of measures, they definitely have a role. The other thing to say is that carbon tax revenues should be recycled or hypothecated in a much more transparent way. At the moment, they're kind of parceled out in a few different directions in a way that's not very transparent. I think people might have a lot more confidence in government's climate action policies if carbon tax revenues were recycled in some sort of clear, committed way to 2030. And then going on to energy market mechanisms, this is where things get really complicated and messy, but the energy systems and the electricity markets are not really tailored, and the measures that they use to regulate prices and so on and competition don't really incentivize decarbonisation. They seem to follow another agenda entirely. And it's very important that any new infrastructure we add to the grid doesn't prolong fossil fuel lock-in, so that we have to start investing in the infrastructure that's going to take us to decarbonisation and not just to solve a short-term energy problem. And finally, on this one, the government should be supporting at international level every possible mechanism and opportunity to phase out fossil fuels, both in the text of the SDG summit that's coming up soon, at the next COP, and at other international fora. It's really important that Ireland shows leadership and also solidarity with the most vulnerable states by supporting in whatever format it comes about, some form of fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Now, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail with all these slides because we take all day, and I know that people will have questions, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. So the key sectors where I think many of us can even contribute kind of some kind of points, without getting overly technical about it, would be in the energy sector, the buildings, transport and agriculture. So I'm just going to run through a couple of points here. Ireland's energy system is kind of bursting at the seams at the moment. We have barely enough generation to meet rising energy demand. And at the same time, we keep adding these data centers. Like, how crazy is that? So it's really important that new renewable generation that's coming on stream is displacing fossil generation and not sort of just allowing the energy system to keep expanding, keeping the fossil infrastructure and assets online. So at the moment, we're still burning coal at Moneypoint, but Moneypoint is not going to be closed by 2025. It looks as though Moneypoint will be converted into oil generation, so slightly lower emissions, but still fossil fuels. And that is kind of a breach of the promise that's been made for a good while now, that Moneypoint would be closed. And that's a major source of greenhouse gas emissions from that one particular site. We support the renewable electricity targets, but it's no point adding more renewable generation if it's being gobbled up by data centers. It just makes no sense at all. So we're going to need much faster deployment of renewables, especially offshore wind. This can be controversial sometimes within the environmental and climate community, but we have to be realistic that this is the only way that Ireland is going to achieve our climate goals, because in order to reduce emissions from all the other sectors, it has to be possible to electrify them and connect them to renewable electricity. So rolling out renewable generation is really, really important. And I would encourage everyone to support that, because sometimes there's backlashes at local level to particular proposals. And I think that's a mistake myself. But we could get into that maybe another time. So public engagement and engagement in sustainable energy communities particularly is really important. And one of the ways to do that is to, because it just works in terms of getting people involved, is to roll out solar PV. Every house, every school, every farm building, everybody should have solar PV. And it works at a very interesting level in terms of motivating and incentivizing people to kind of think about energy and to kind of participate and benefit directly from the lower electricity costs as a result. A couple of points there about biomethane, but I won't get into that now. So when it comes to the built environment, it's kind of, we all live in homes. We understand directly what it's like if you live in a cold home. You really know about it. Your bills are higher, and your welfare is affected by that. So we have been, in Friends of the Earth at least, through my colleague Claire O'Connor, who I think is here, have been joining with other social justice organisations in devising some recommendations to the government about addressing energy poverty, which really came to the fore after the invasion of Ukraine. We had those massive price hikes in energy costs. So the recommendations that they have are really worth mirroring and supporting. And I haven't included them all here, but essentially the idea is to prioritise in all of the retrofitting programmes and the funding that goes with it, whether that's from SEAI or from local authorities, to prioritise the people in energy poverty. So the cold homes for low-income renters and homeowners first. And that is something I think we could all get behind. Now, there are other reasons for energy poverty. So we also have to look at supporting the call for raising social welfare rates, because that's important as well. Energy costs are an income issue as well as a housing infrastructure issue. The rental sector is particularly tricky to address. So the government is going to need special targeted measures for that. And there's a whole set of issues around the retrofitting industry per se, and how to ensure that there are enough skills and supports to kind of deliver on the retrofitting plan. But I would encourage you to go to the Friends of the Earth website, and you'll find the resource there. It's very useful, and you can copy and paste all 14 of the demands straight into your answers on the Climate Action Plan consultation. So I will skip on to transport. Again, transport is something very visceral. We all wrestle with congestion and noise and dust and the absence of public transport and all the rest of it. And I think it's our public realm the quality of that is being eroded very dramatically with the rise in car dependency. And it's something it makes me very sad, actually, because of the way it affects particularly children's access to public space. And it's so dangerous for kids to even make their own way to school in urban areas now. And that wasn't the Dublin I grew up in. So it requires some very urgent reversals of recent policy. And firstly, we need to just shift our attitude and paradigm thinking essentially around road infrastructure to make sure that every investment in road is really about prioritizing vulnerable road users at junctions, and that we're not increasing capacity for cars. We should be repurposing the existing road network and reallocating road space for public transport and active travel. Doing that on the ground can be controversial. So it's really important to have local involvement and engagement and give people a chance to absorb the implications and why it's being done, and that it isn't just being, hitting communities with a hammer, right? We're taking away your parking spaces and replacing it with Bus Connect. It has to be done in a way that wins people's support, because the delays to Bus Connect and active travel threaten to scupper a lot of this. And, it has to be possible to win people over. It has to be possible. Some of the active travel teams, for example, don't have community liaison staff. And that's not something I've put in here, but I think it's an important recommendation, because if you just leave it to the engineers, they'll design great cycle paths, but they won't necessarily win public acceptance. So we need to electrify the public transport system. We need to increase the frequency and reliability of public transport. We can reduce the fares. It's a very successful measure. I actually spent a week on my holidays in Spain where each trip cost 40 cents. And, over a week in Bilbao, and with myself and my two daughters, we struggled to spend €12 on public transport for the whole week. It was incredibly cheap. They also have excellent public transport. So we need that as well. We need more light rail. We have infrastructure companies authorities that know how to do light rail. We've done it before. So why haven't we got more light rail lines proposed for Ireland cities and for Dublin in particular? It's really important. We cannot expect people to switch to public transport if it doesn't exist. It has to be put in place. EVs are part of the solution, but only part of it. And it's only going to work if there's charging infrastructure. And if we are serious, we're going to implement a date for ending the sale of internal combustion engines, so petrol and diesel cars. And finally, congestion charges have to be part of the picture. All the research shows that what is most successful in terms of switching over to active travel and public transport is a combination of carrot and sticks. So you have to provide the public transport and the cycle facilities, but you also have to, offer something like a stick and penalize motorists for driving when the alternative exists. Those things are controversial, but if they're proposed, I would think that we need to get behind them and try to make sure that they are rolled out in a way that's as fair and publicly acceptable. And finally, on agriculture, I'm running out of time. I will actually not talk about this because I think it's more important that you get a chance to ask questions. So I'll share the slides here and you can read those yourselves. And thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sadhbh, for such detailed and practical solutions as to what can actually be done to reduce Ireland's emissions across a wide variety of sectors. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. So these are for either or both of you. Do you think there's been enough promotion of this public consultation? And which sector will need to reduce its emissions the most in order to get back on track and stay within our climate targets? Do you would like to jump in first?
Just raised a question about these types of public consultations. We do a lot of them in Ireland. There's very little feedback as to how your participation in the consultation actually was listened to or heard. it keeps a lot of NGOs very busy doing consultations to be seen to be doing consultations. I think there's a sort of an implicit expectation that if you're an NGO, you have to have a submission in. If you don't, like, you know, because we've got this strange situation where government is the primary funder of most of our NGOs. I'm not sure we do public consultation right in this country. And this issue particularly is so challenging, right? Because as Sadhbh has correctly laid out there, it's incredibly complex. You need to be an expert in economics, in transport, in agriculture. And actually, that's a failing of the climate movement probably historically, is that we haven't been good enough at articulating that this matters to everyone, so that we need everyone's expertise. Instead, the climate expert tried to internalize elements of all of these diverse fields that you can't be an expert across all of, right? And so as a layperson, how are you supposed to just jump on and give input into what you think the government should be doing in terms of improving our grid in order to be able to take renewable loads? It doesn't make sense. So is there enough being done to promote the consultation? Probably not, but there never really is a lot being done to promote consultations. Second question, I think the more important question is, do these types of consultations work, or should we go much more local, invest money significantly in public consultation, realizing there's a real hearts and minds battle here that has to be won if climate action is to be successful?
Yeah, thanks.
I would agree with Sean there completely. So just to go to the second question, in terms of which sectors, because of the way the sectoral emission ceilings have been allocated, it's probably fair to say that the sector that will struggle the most to achieve its target is the transport sector. Because while agriculture is our largest emitter, it has a much lower target. It has a target of reducing emissions by 25%, whereas the transport target is overall by 2030 a 50% reduction. And sure, you can just look around you. You know, you don't have to be a climate modeler or a wizard to kind of anticipate the challenges there. Eamon Ryan, the Minister for Climate Action, is famous for it. He says this a lot, that it takes 10 years in Ireland to roll out a bus lane, and something like 15 years to, what was the next one? Kind of a Lewis line, was that 15 years? So if he's correct, and it takes us that long to roll out the public transport infrastructure, you can see that we are not going to achieve our targets by 2030. So what is probably required is, and this is why the reallocation of road space is so important, because you don't have to build anything. You don't even have to dig up the utilities underneath the road. If you're willing to take the tough decision and reallocate road space away from car parking or car storage, as some of my friends call it, over to, you know, public transport that we do have, the Bus Connect and active travel. That is something that can be rolled out much more quickly. But that's the only way that we're going to achieve our targets. And until last year, the government was much more heavily committed to ramping up EV sales as a way of achieving the target. And they've realized that is not going to work, but they've realized it very late in the day. So unfortunately, excuse me. So I think the transport sector is the one that you, as local activists, maybe need to think about getting involved in at a local level, depending on your work, whether you're working in a community or whether you're working nationally with other community groups. It's the area that probably requires the most concerted changes at a community level, and to ensure that the local authorities do have pipelines of projects for active travel, that they get implemented, that they don't get held up by populist politicians. And I shall stop there, Clodagh, before I get carried away.
Thank you so much. We're getting some great questions, so I'll just keep going through them. So Caitlin says, carbon budgets are legally binding, but it feels as if this doesn't mean much as the budgets are being exceeded year on year. Is there anything that can be done to increase the incentive for government to meet the carbon budget? It seems that it is just not a priority. Do either of you want to jump in on that one?
I think it's very difficult. Yeah, because the law says this is legally binding, but there are actually no consequences if the law is broken. Now, I leave it to the legal experts in community law and mediation to tell us how you might litigate it. But the problem is, at a very practical level, that you can only really litigate it, at least failure to meet the carbon budget, after you've failed to meet the carbon budget, in which case it's too late. So we need kind of anticipatory governance. We need anticipatory action. We need to say, the whole point about the carbon reporting cycle in the Act is if there's a sense from the EPA reports and the Climate Change Advisory Council reports that more needs to be done to accelerate climate action to achieve the target, then the onus is on the minister to come back with a climate action plan that reflects that. So this is why this consultation is really important. So following on those EPA reports, the minister is supposed to go, oh dear, we're not on track. We've got to do more stuff than we originally thought we would have to do. And that's the only way to get the carbon budgets met. And I would say as well that there's a particularly important period coming up in the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action, because that committee has a responsibility for scrutinising the ministers. And that is supposed to happen in the autumn, prior to the adoption of the new climate action plan. So if the committee does its job properly and, demands specific proposals from the ministers on how they are going to respond to the EPA reports, we might well see things turning around a bit. But unfortunately, Caitlin, there isn't really anything that happens once they miss the carbon budgets, except that it gets loaded onto the following carbon budget and then loaded onto the one after that. So it's like building up a big mountain of carbon debt.
Well, it seems to have gotten sick of us and left. So I take Nessan's question. Oh, she's back. I noticed Nessan asking about the mobilisation and how the marriage equality campaign we can learn from. I've been thinking a lot about this issue specifically for quite a while, including some pieces of work we did with Task around communicating climate issues. I think one of the challenges between conceptualizing what needs to be done as the marriage equality campaign is that was a yes/no question on an issue of basic human rights that was glaringly obvious to anyone who wasn't just homophobic, right? I feel like what we're talking about here is so much more nuanced. I tip back and forth between maybe we shouldn't be talking about climate at all. Ultimately, it's about better houses, better cities, better access to rural areas, better, it nearly, and it comes back to the point about the level of expertise required to play a part in everything. I think we have to, I think, first of all, it's not a nearly movement building. People just have to see that their lives are getting better and then they'll want more of it and you'll create that virtuous cycle. But it's no good telling people who've been failed repeatedly by systems that continue to exclude them that if we just build a movement, everything will get better. People have to start seeing that climate action is good for you. It does move the needle in terms of standards of living. It does help you live a little bit of a healthier and happier life. What where the conversation could be a housing thing. Like obviously, if we were building massive mixed income social housing that was sustainable and was creating communities that were genuinely mixed and diverse and providing good quality of life to people, I think that would help. But one thing, and I've touched on it in terms of the offshore wind and the kind of issues around wind farms, or even in North County Dublin, there's some questions around solar. Now, we have to question the extractiveness of the model that we're building. We're building a new economy, and currently we're just modeling it exactly on the old economy, where the same people benefit and the same people suffer. And rather than thinking like, hey, we're going to build an enormous amount of offshore wind, why doesn't the government raise that money and build it itself? And then the revenues that flow from that, the enormous revenues that flow from that, go back into our budgets to do more. It's the same with the solar that we're building. Like it should be owned en masse by communities or local or national governments, so that for the next 20, 30 years, there's just this flow of money that can be used to do good in other ways. And I think we're really missing a trick with this. And it's something when all of our wind is sold and all of our sun is sold, we'll realize, we had a real opportunity there to do something different.
Thanks so much, Sean and Sadhbh. And sorry, I lost my connection there for a moment. I'm just checking to see if there are any other questions we have missed. Yeah, I think that is everything. So just to wrap up, I'm just going to share Community Law Mediation's Environmental Justice Guide consultation in the chat box again. Please do feel free to use it and adapt it and personalize it to yourself and your own situation. And I suppose just to kind of wrap up, this consultation is really, really imperfect. To echo what Sadhbh said earlier, we were really frustrated with the nature of this consultation. And as Sean has said, there is a huge number and volume of consultations that is very hard to keep up with. And it's also not easy to see sometimes how our participation informs these consultations. That said, this is an imperfect means of participating. It's one of the few ways that we actually can at the moment inform government policy. And I suppose we know that the longer climate action is delayed, the more difficult it will be as the impacts worsen and as the window to remain within 1.5 narrows. It's more likely that the policy response will be abrupt and forceful and disorderly, but communities can actually be empowered and supported through a fair and inclusive transition. And I suppose while climate change is often described as a threat multiplier, it can instead be a justice multiplier if climate change isn't treated as an issue in silo, but is instead addressed through other social justice issues like housing and like income and social inequality. So thank you so much to Sean and Sadhbh for all of their contributions today. Thank you for everyone for joining us and for the really engaged discussion. Really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you for tuning in. See you, everyone.